Good afternoon and welcome to The Wretched, The Wicked, The Weak. What are the worst portrayals of women in the Bible? And can these readings be challenged? I am both delighted and honoured to be chairing a session with four of the most esteemed, interesting and inspiring female educators I know. I'd like to introduce, from right to left, Jack Nicholls. She is an artist and a Jewish educator who uses art to engage with traditional Jewish ideas in non-traditional ways. Seated next to her is Tilla Crowne, an artist who works with organic and living materials, dealing with themes of memory and identity. To my second right is Deborah Kahn-Harris, principal of Leo Beck College, where she was ordained in 1996. She holds a PhD in Bible, specialising in feminist biblical criticism. And next to me is Danya Ruttenberg, an author, one of whose books has been nominated for the Sammy Raw Prize, and she's been named by Newsweek as one of 10 rabbis to watch. Now, each speaker has chosen a woman from the Bible to discuss, and we'll hear about the very worst presentations of women and femininity, and our speakers' views as to what we might do about this today, to reinterpret and challenge these readings. There will be time for questions at the end, so please do hold on to those views and questions for that moment. Danya, would you like to start?
Sure. Who's the woman you've chosen? Delilah. Interesting. Yes. So usually, at least in America, and this is one of those little cultural moments. I don't know how that plays out over here, but in the States, to refer to someone as a Delilah is a specific and known insult, right? It means that a woman is seductive and manipulative and cares more about money than about matters of the heart, and is, in many ways a hussy, or as we might say today, a slut, right? I mean, Delilah she's a reviled figure, and so I'd like to make the case that actually she should be called up as a hero. So in the story, in the book of Judges, we see this whole arc of Samson, right? He sets his eye on this woman from Timnah. She's Philistine, and during this time, the Philistines had been ruling over the Israelites in the land. And there's this whole, we don't need to get into it, this whole business at the wedding with this intrigue. He's got this riddle that he wants to stump the Philistines on, and then the new wife gets the answer out, and so they manage to say, they gotcha him. They manage to get him, and he freaks out and kills a lot of people, and then moves on, and later on, he sees Delilah, and he decides that he wants her. We never ever actually see that she wants him, right? The text says, wait, I don't have the verse where he sees her. It doesn't matter. He sees her. He loves her. He wants her. And then the Philistines say, basically, we're going to give you many, 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 many shekels of silver if you figure out the secret to his downfall. And so she does, and she basically, in bed, presumably, says, tell me what the secret is. Tell me what will bring about your downfall. And so then eventually he tells her the truth, and she causes his end and the end of a great many other people along the way, but she basically kills him in the process. She weakens him. He dies. So we don't ever see that she loves him. We don't ever see that she wants him. He's a big hero to the Jews, right? He's this man who's been ordained by God. He's going to help redeem the Jews from the hands of the Philistines. However, she's Philistine, so he's a threat to her people. And so what we have here is a man with a proven track record of anger issues who sets his sight on this woman. And in the ancient world, even I imagine in cross-tribal connections, consent is a complicated and tricky thing. So she winds up with this guy. We don't ever see her saying yes. We don't ever see her saying, yes, this sounds like a great idea. She's just with this guy. She owes him nothing. And so she is offered by her people the chance to save him, to save them, right? She's offered the chance to protect her people from this threat coming in. And she's offered a lot of money. And when we remember in the ancient world that women who were financially independent were not exactly dime a dozen, right? This is a rare, rare thing for a woman to be able to be without the protection of a husband, to be without the protection of a father, to be not under the thumb of patriarchy. And so Delilah leaned in, right? So instead of saying that, women who are in control of their sexuality are bad, evil sluts, and we're gonna, shame them and they're terrible, she basically uses the one tool that she has at her disposal. It is the only tool she has, and she uses it to redeem her people and to liberate herself in the process. Now, what's more interesting is when you start to look at Delilah as juxtaposed to other famous heroines in the Bible. There's Yael. There's most famously Yehudit, Judith. There are a lot of parallels that I'll get to in a second. But also Esther and Tamar and Sarah in the whole side story with Pharaoh. Many, many women use their sexuality as a tool to either save themselves, and pikuach nefesh dochet kol, right? The pikuach, saving a life should trump everything. Or they use it to help their people in some way, or to help their family. And so she is in this clear line of women who are using their sexuality because it's the only thing that they have in a manipulative way. And, as Judith, for example, sneaks into Holofernes' tent. She's Jewish. He's, this invading army. She seduces him, cuts off his head. Hooray, she's liberated the Jews. The fact that Delilah isn't Jewish means that she's on the other side. She's the enemy side, right? Samson is one of our guys. She brought him down, therefore she's evil. But her actions are completely and totally consistent with that of almost every other biblical heroine that we hold up. And so I wonder if it's not time to see her on her own terms and to see her as someone who's in control of her own power, who's able to say no to whatever degree that she's able, and to put the interests of her people ahead of those of a man who has decided that he wants her, irrespective of what she wants. And she's a straight shooter. She says very clearly, tell me the secret of your strength so that someone might overpower her. Someone might overpower you. He's very, very, either he's a complete and total moron, which is possible, or he's totally unclear on what she's asking and what he's offering her. And so she is actually not manipulative at all, but clear and direct, and chooses to take her own independence and the power of those that she loves in actually highly communicative negotiation with a man who had decided that she should be his. So, Team Delilah.
So, I've chosen the story of a woman who doesn't have a name in the Bible. She's known in the biblical text as Bat Yiftach, which is simply translated as the daughter of Yiftach, or Jephthah, as some people might know him. Who is Yiftach? Yiftach is a judge. He's introduced to us in the story as he's a Gileadite, he's a Gibor Chayil, he's a strong warrior, and he's Ben Isha Zona. He's the son of a prostitute, right? So, first sentence about him, he's a big, strong man, and he's the son of a prostitute. And as soon as his brothers are old enough, the sons of his father's proper wife, he is chucked out of the family. They push him out. He's a marginal character, but he's also a very strong man with a chip on his shoulder. I think we could say it quite reasonably. He's not known, particularly in rabbinic materials, as being a particularly learned man, but a good warrior. And so, even despite the fact that he has a number of successes in battle, when he goes up against the Ammonites, he makes the following vow. I'll read it in English. He says, "If you deliver the Ammonites into my hands, then whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me on my safe return from the Ammonites shall be the eternal ones, and shall be offered by me as a burnt offering." Okay? So he says, if you do this, God, and you help me be successful, whatever's the first thing out my front door when I come home, I'm going to sacrifice it to you in quite literal, on the altar, burning it sort of sacrifice. The rabbis say he's a complete moron. What if chas v'shalom a dog had walked out of his front door when he opened it up? Dogs are not kosher animals, you know. He would have had to offer a burnt sacrifice of an unkosher animal. That is a very stupid thing for him to have done. However, what comes out of the front door to greet him upon his safe return from battle and his defeat of the Ammonites is, in fact, his daughter. She is the first thing that comes out of the front door with her timbrel in her hands, dancing. Now, those of you who know your Bible pretty well will recognize women dancing with timbrels, right? That's what Miriam HaNeviah, Miriam the prophetess, does upon safe crossing of the Red Sea. She dances with the women and their timbrels. So this is a known phenomenon. This is not something surprising or unusual in the ancient world. Women went out and danced with timbrels, with drums, upon the safe return of their men home from battle. And yet, somehow, dear old Yiftach doesn't give a moment's thought to the possibility that the first thing to come out of his front door when he comes back from battle will be his daughter, whom the text says, quite interestingly, is his only child. He has no other sons or daughters. Does that sound like anyone you know? Who else has an argument about sacrificing their child and says, which one do you mean? My son, my only son, your only son, the one you love. Isaac, right? We know how this story ends, right? How does this story end? It ends with, yes, you're supposed to sacrifice, but, you know, there'll be a ram and the angel of God will stay your hand and it'll all be okay. Except here, that is not what happens. Not what happens at all. Instead, immediately upon seeing his daughter, Yiftach rips his clothes in a gesture of mourning. He tears his clothes and he says, you've brought me low. You've become my trouble. Right? As though she was supposed to know. He says, I vowed a vow to God, and now I can't do anything about it. Right? It's your fault I made a stupid vow, and you came out the front door, and now I'm not going to have any choice about things. And then she says, well, if you vowed a vow, and seeing as you defeated the Ammonites, you best do whatever it was you said you were going to do. But then she says, can I just ask one favor first? Just before you do that, can me and my mates go off to the mountains for 2 months and bewail my virginity? That's what the text says. It actually says in Hebrew, it says, betulai, maidenhood. It's unclear exactly what it is that they are weeping over. It's also unclear what she thinks is actually going to happen to her, right? Because it doesn't say where he made his vow. It doesn't say he made it in earshot of her. And at no point has he said, my vow was to sacrifice you. Excuse me. So he says, yes, go ahead. Go off to the mountains for 2 months and do your wailing with your friends. And that's what she does. And then she comes back after 2 months. And the text said, "Vaya'as la et nidro asher nader v'hi lo yada ish." And he did to her according to what he vowed, and she hadn't known a man. Odd, right? Here the text is talking about infanticide, or not an infant in this case, but a child, killing a child as a sacrifice. And by the way, she hadn't known a man. So there's some strangeness going on in this text. What she thinks is happening, what he thinks he's doing, and it never actually comes out and says he sacrifices her on an altar. It says he did to her according to what he vowed. And then it says, and so it became a custom in Israel for the maidens of Israel to go every year for 4 days in the year and chant dirges for the daughter of Yiftach. Interesting. I know about you. As a woman, I've never been introduced to the custom where we're supposed to go off 4 days of every year and chant dirges to the daughter of Yiftach. So there seems to be something in this story that appears to be etiological, that is to say, to be a kind of explanation of some sort of custom that was happening in antiquity, where girls were going off for 4 days a year and doing something. There is a horror story at the root of this, where this man, who is a warrior, who's supposed to be a leader in the Israelite community, actually sacrifices his daughter. The one thing we know we don't do, right? That separates us. That's what pagans do. That's God's great test to Abraham, but we know God would never let it actually happen. Here, the text seems to suggest that it happens for real. And she never even has a name. She is nothing except the property of her father. Her mother doesn't exist at all in the text. The text is totally silent. And she seems to feel she has absolutely no choice. The Midrash also says, by the way, not only is Yiftach an idiot because a dog might have come out the front door, it also says he's also an idiot because there was a high priest in his time, and he could have gone to the high priest and asked how he gets out of doing his vows, and the high priest would have let him out of the vows by doing X, Y, and Z, and then he wouldn't have had to sacrifice her, but he was so ignorant that he didn't even know that there was a process for this. But no comment on her life, on who she was. Can we redeem this text? Is there a way to redeem this text? One way we redeem this text, I don't know if it's a redemption, is to actually tell this story. Because every time I hear somebody talk about the Akedah and say, this is what Jews never have done, I think of this story and my blood boils, right? Yeah, Isaac gets saved, but the daughter of Yiftach, there is silence. There is no God in this story to stay her father's hand. We can also tell this story to remind ourselves that there are people in the world who are abusive, and that the way we respond to them should not be to say, whatever you said you have to do, you do it to me. In fact, the one place that I know of where the story is written in any more significant of fashion is in a very curious text from antiquity. It's something called the Book of Biblical Antiquities. It's a piece that we refer to as a piece of intertestamental literature. It's not midrash. It is not part of the biblical canon. It is sometimes in academic circles as pseudo-Philo. That's because it was falsely attributed to the authorship of Philo. And it's one of this genre of what we call rewritten Bibles. And it tells the story here. One thing it does for us is it gives her a name. Her name is She'ela, which means a question. Which is already something quite beautiful. What kind of question is she? What does that mean for somebody to be a question? Is there a question about whether she's really sacrificed? In the medieval period, Kimchi, one of the medieval commentators, says, no, she was never sacrificed. The text doesn't say he actually bound her onto an altar and killed her. No. He did what the vow said, but what it means is he shut her up in a house and she never had any children. That's why it says she never knew a man. Of course, Kimchi never says, what does it mean for somebody to live shut up in a house for their entire life and never have progeny and never know another human being? Is that not in itself a kind of worse death than death itself? Anyway, to go back to pseudo-Philo. So pseudo-Philo gives her a name. And it also gives her a story. It's not a comfortable story, but it's a story. And it's a story very much, if anybody has ever read Iphigenia at Aeolus, which is Euripides' last play, it's the story of how Agamemnon is stuck on this island with all of his armies assembled, setting out to go recapture Helen of Troy. And there is no wind because the wind goddess is angry with him. And he is told the only way to appease her is to sacrifice his virgin daughter, Iphigenia. And it is this story. And at the end of this story, after much travail, which I won't go into, Iphigenia has a long soliloquy where she eventually agrees to be sacrificed by her father in order to prevent greater evils from happening. And in Pseudo-Philo, a speech very similar to Iphigenia's is put into the mouth of She'ela, where she is given voice, where she is given the opportunity to consent in a way that the biblical text doesn't really, because the biblical text never really says to us that she knew what was happening to her. But in Pseudo-Philo she does, and she finds this sort of heroic way of coming to terms with the brutality of what's to happen to her. Now, I don't think it's redemption, but I think it is an opportunity to hear the voice of somebody who has been abused. And it is a way of hearing the kind of story that we don't want to hear very often, but that we know happens in the world. And it's a way of us questioning and hearing in her name, in that She'ela, in that question, our own need to stand up and question when these sorts of things happen around us. So I'll leave you with that.
Hello. So the person that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to call her Naama. There is a tradition for calling her this, but she's actually another unnamed woman, surprise, surprise, in the Torah. So Naama is aka Mrs. Noah. So I think the problem with this text is that we're all really familiar with the bare bones of the story of Noah. I've been reading some great children's books all about Noah, and they feature Mrs. Noah heavily. Some places she's called Mrs. Noah, some places she is called Naama, but she becomes this wonderful foil for everything that a wife should be, everything that the idea of a wife should become. In the actual text, before we get to the actual story of Noach, we have a long genealogy, all the descendants of Cain, which is sort of actually quite interesting because in many ways Noah and Noah's wife are almost like Adam and Eve Mark II. Everything is erased. We're starting over. We're kind of, let's do this again. We'll take two of this, and two humans. No, made sort of and their kids' wives, and we'll just put them on a boat, and we'll sort of, erase the entire world. And I find Naama fascinating because, well, you look at Eve, and there are lots of problematic things to do with the characterization of Eve in the story of Adam and Eve, but she has agency. Even in that act of eating the fruit, offering the fruit, talking about the fruit, she's there as a personality. Lots of people sort of over the years, sort of project things onto her, but she exists within the text. And Naama doesn't really exist within the text. She is almost like Vortex Eve. She sucks stories towards her. And you see the commentators, and you see sort of the rabbis, and you see other religious texts from other religions take this vacuum and serve it as a kind of platter of, here is the archetypal wife. Eve is the archetypal woman. Naama is a placeholder for the idea of what contemporary societies think wife should be. So we get these fascinating, there's a medieval Christian tradition of having mystery plays, especially at this time of year. This is what the tradition of nativity plays come out of, where they would dramatise passages from the Bible. And you get this medieval tradition of the story of Noah being a real favourite because you have the character wife of Noah. Now, she doesn't have a name at this point. She's just wife of Noah. And she is a nag. She is a woman who comes and says, Noah, you're an idiot. Your boat is a stupid idea. What on earth are you doing? And she comes and she gathers with her gossips, and they all antagonize Noah, and they basically say, what are you doing, you stupid man? And this, I think, is kind of symptomatic of everything that people fear about the role of wife. Is she my helpmeet? Is she my foil? Is she sort of her indoors? Do I dread her? Do I sort of, do I rely on her? This kind of medieval sort of view of Mrs. Noah as kind of nagging, sort of downplaying, sort of slightly abusive wife is easy to run with as a kind of like, yeah, well, it's medieval times and they didn't actually have, great views of women, and this kind of sort of fits into society, but actually, no, it really doesn't. She was a favourite character. She was much lauded as a nag, which is really kind of, I think, bizarre to think about, that she was kind of a foil to Noah, but sort of she was really quite loved as a kind of a sort of sardonic, bolshy sort of presence within the story that kind of doesn't exist within the text. There are most of the things that depict Mrs. Noah now have a kind of stream of this sort of inherited kind of medieval view of skeptical, naggish Mrs. Noah and goodness, sweetness, and life sort of archetypical wife Mrs. Noah. So I always really like looking at children's stories because these, I think, distill really what we think about these characters, because they're what we want to transmit to the next generation. They're how we teach our kids about who these characters are, about what we think about them. Sort of, these are our first meetings, our first views of who these people are, and actually it sort of then formulates how we relate to the Torah, to our role, and these are our first role models, and really what does that say about us and what we see in the text. So we have the story of Noah where she is just, sort of take you and your wife and your sons and their wives, and sometimes she's below the sons and sometimes she's above the sons in that pecking order of how Noah mentions them and how God mentions them. And yet we have this kind of role model where she embodies a kind of ambiguity with how we feel about ourselves and sort of how we feel about sort of women within the text. We're there to kind of counterpoint the men, but we don't really have a sort of an archetypal form to sort of project ourselves upon. We have all these women where, even if they're characterized as the weak and the wicked, they at least have some agency. Lot's wife looks backwards. Vashti refuses to come out and dance before the king. Where is Naamah? She doesn't have anything to hold on to, and so she just acts as this vessel for all our kind of hopes and fears and desires and dreams. And that role of acting as a vessel, especially Talmudically, is such a kind of archetypical way of depicting women. We are vessels for children, we are vessels for other people's hopes and weights of expectation, and I'm not sure that there is a particular way to redeem her as a character from this text, because she literally isn't there. So really what I think of her as is almost a warning. There is a lot of female erasure in our texts, but that offers an opportunity. It offers us the ability to look at these and pattern how we want to be seen, how we want to move on, and what we want to do as women within our texts, as women from outside of the text, and in a wider Jewish context.
Thank you. It's quite a hard act to follow for these guys. So in the introduction, Toni mentioned that I'm an artist. I also teach Tanakh, and I teach at the London School of Jewish Studies. And for about the last 10, 11 years or so, I've been teaching the Book of Kings. And one of the things I do in these classes, which are more an overview of the book, is that I have this table of monarchs, of kings, where I go through and kind of the kingdom splits between the north and the south. You've got the northern kingdom of Israel, you've got the south king of Judah. And I go through this table of kings, and I basically sum up kind of who the different kings were, how long they reigned, and whether or not God was pleased with them. Like, you know, were they evil king? Are they a very evil king? Are they a good king? Mainly they're evil kings. Evil being described as they worship idols, as well as murdering and killing. Mainly it's the idolatry which bothers Book of Kings. Anyway, but as I go through this chart with the students, and it happens every single year, we go through the story of the kings of Judah, the southern kings. And I get to a name, and I kind of do it quickly in the chart, because I say after the break we're going to learn this story in depth. And I get to the name Atalia. And I go, this one's not a king, this one's a queen. And everyone gets a little bit too excited. We've got a woman. We've got a female character who's on the throne, a leader. And I see the students are waiting to hear of something good about her. They want the feminist hero. They do. And I want to give it to them, but I can't, because I'm dealing with Atalia. And Atalia, and the Book of Kings is a wonderful book to read, because it's really messy and everything goes horribly wrong and it's a tragedy. And there's plenty of wars and killing and idolatry that runs throughout. So it's lots of fun and it's great fun to teach. And I get to the story of Atalia, and I have to this is where you break it to the students that maybe this book called the Tanakh isn't always as spiritually uplifting as they would kind of like to see it. And so the story of Atalia is basically this. She is the daughter of Achav, who is the king of the north. He's a northern king. He's an Israelite king in the north, married to Jezebel, who was responsible for introducing a different type of idolatry in the northern kingdom of Baal worship, and sort of set them off. Although they weren't doing great before she came along. They were all worshipping idols before she came along. You can't completely blame it on her, although the rabbis do have a good try at that one. But anyway, so she is a northern kingdom princess who gets married to a southern king, a Judah king, as a kind of peace deal that is going on between the north and the south, because this is a time when the kingdom is divided and a peace needs to, and every so often there is peace between the two nations. Mostly they're fighting each other. So anyway, this time the Judah king has made peace with the northern king, and they've made a marriage with their children. And Achav's daughter, Atalia, crosses the border, and she marries the king. She marries Yoram, who is Yehoshaphat's son. Now the king dies, and Yoram, this other king, Atalia's husband, becomes king. He reigns for a little bit of time. He's actually killed in battle. And it's described there, although the father was a good guy, because he's now married to Atalia, he is following her practices, and he is following the kingdom of the north of Achav, and he is following Baal worship. And he is responsible for the idolatry and introducing that type of idolatry to the south. Again, though, not the first time that the kings of Judah were involved in idolatry, although it is blamed on Atalia, this particular one. He is killed in battle with Edom, and his son becomes king. And his son also is like his mother, follows his mother's idolatrous ways, and actually goes up to visit his uncle. When I teach this, by the way, I have a very nice family tree, so it's not quite so confusing as to kind of say all this. And he goes up and visits his uncle, and he gets killed while he's in the north, because what's going on in the north, although there's lots of idolatrous kings and practices around, is that God has there's a prophet that has appointed Yehu to come and kill everybody involved with the house of Ahav and idolatry, and does this, and including the king of Judah. So there is Tilla. Her husband is dead. Her son is dead. Her mother and her father are dead. Everyone is dead around her. She is in the south. Who is going to take the throne? Tilla takes the throne. But the first thing she needs to do is get rid of any rivals. So she kills anybody who can claim the throne. It happens to be her grandchildren. And she goes on a lovely killing spree of her grandchildren, one of whom, the youngest, is rescued by her daughter, who then hides her in the temple. And she actually reigns for about 7 or 8 years while this baby grows up and is brought up by the high priest. And then there's a coup, and it all comes to her, and she's brought into the temple and sees this young boy king being crowned, her grandson. And she is not a Jewish grandmother in that she's fairly, my grandson the king. No, she realizes she's in trouble, and she calls treason, and they come out and kill her. And they say, oh, but don't kill her in the temple, because we can't have a dead body in the temple. Take her out the back, which is what they do. And it's not a very long story in the Book of Kings. I've pretty much given you all the details. I mean, she has a lot of agency. She makes a lot of decisions. She runs the army. She has quite a big speaking part in the comparative, like, considering the entire story isn't that long. She does have a speaking part. And you can see very clearly what a political maneuver she's doing, and how she's not relying on anybody else for protection, and she's protecting herself. But she is the murdering grandmother queen. And maybe if you're thinking about baby names for your daughter, Tilla shouldn't really be on your list. And what I want to say in terms of why I chose to bring her is because what I think it highlights for me is really what my students reacted when I brought her in the chart and they realised there was a queen in the chart, was that desire, that wish, that hope, that because there was a female character here that I was going to teach, there'll be something redemptive about that. There'll be like a role model. And at the moment, my daughter is 11 years old, and we're doing the sort of various bat mitzvah preparations. What a delight. And there was one course which we were doing, which was going through various female characters in Tanakh, and so that we can learn from them. And amazingly, they've all got such great chesed. They're all very caring. They're all very good. They're very beautiful. Some of them are very modest. And I'm saying that going, really? Really? We're doing this? Are we? Really? Again? And it's... and I find this desire to kind of want to tell the female story is actually doing a disservice, because it's not really wanting to tell the female story. Because to tell those missing stories is to really look at the stories in all their complexity. Because it's not about finding her stories and reading them in. It's actually really acknowledging all the messiness of of the narratives that is a part of our heritage, every single part of it, including the murdering grandmother, because it's a fascinating story about power. It's a fascinating story about control, about what happens when, with all the different power bases, you've got the high priest being a counter voice to the kingship. The gender part is a huge part of that. But to tell it, just to look at these female characters and want to redeem them, want to read them because we want to find role models, I think is doing a massive disservice to our very rich narratives that have come down to us. One of the things that struck me actually listening to the three of you is it's like one of the things a lot of the Midrash don't do with Tilla, and I'm quite surprised, is that they don't sexualize her. She's not Jezebel. She's not Delilah. She is not seductress. She has power in a very different way. It's not using her sexuality. She just claims the throne. And I find that quite striking that they don't do that to her, because they do that with plenty of the other women. So that was just a bit of an aside. about that. And so that's really what I want to say. It's just that some of these stories of these women are wretched and wicked and weak and also quite wonderful in themselves. And there is no need to kind of put a spin on them other than just learn them for what they are.
Thank you to all the panellists. I'm sure you'll all agree that that was absolutely fascinating, and I've certainly learnt ever such a lot about women that I previously knew very little about. I'm sure you have stacks of questions. If you'd like to stick your hand up, I will ask a Limmud volunteer. Okay, I will bring you the mic and pass it around.
I have a question for Deborah. You talked about Yiftach's daughter. I've heard a response to that story, an Orthodox response, which says that she's to be revered as like this selfless, wonderful girl because she sort of saved her stupid father from a terrible by basically making him guiltless. She says it's okay, you can do that, and that's like to be lauded and like approved of. What do you think of that response?
The polite word is apologetics. The less polite word I probably won't say from sitting up here. Look, you can read the story that way if you want to. My response to that, though, is she was murdered by her father, right? In order to do what? To get him out of some words that came out of his mouth? I mean, it's nonsense. How often do we, particularly as women, feel like we have to be the ones to make sacrifices in order that somebody else can be successful, somebody else can be happy, somebody else can be enabled? It's another way for us to live our lives, to be full and complete human beings. And for her not to, it's a model, it's clearly a model from antiquity. Iphigenia, as I mentioned, is another one of those sorts of heroic kind of Greek, tragic heroine models where, the ultimate sacrifice is to allow somebody else to slit your throat, right? But for what? For what did she actually die? Assuming that we think the text does mean she literally died, and I think it does mean that. For what? What would God have done if he hadn't murdered his daughter? Would he have undefeated the Ammonites? I don't know. Would perhaps Yiftach himself have suffered? And perhaps he deserved to. Why did he need saving by his daughter's life? Yeah? And every time we tell that story, every time we as women tell each other the only way for our husband to succeed is that we stay home and look after the kids, or the only way for our father to be happy is for us to put our heads down and be very quiet in the background, or every time we say the only way for our children to succeed is for us to be at home and sacrifice our careers and our lives for their greater good, every time we do that, what we say is my life isn't important enough to look after me a little bit. Could there have been a third way? Could Shayla have said to her dad, look, I'm not willing to die for this, but I'm willing to help you out. Let's think together how we solve this problem. Let's think together how both of us get careers and children and lives that are meaningful is a much better solution. But the reality, I would say, is that, for me, she's the portrait of an abused child. And her voice is important only because we have to remember that those people do exist in our communities, and we have to find a way to hear them as well.
I've got another question for Deborah. Sorry. I just wondered why you think that story is included in the book. I mean, obviously we can put a sort of a modern or retrospective interpretation on what we can take from it now, but it's a very strange story to have in amongst all the kind of historical shenanigans that are going on at the time, that it doesn't really fit in at all with any of that, which are really stories of leadership and failed leadership and all that kind of stuff.
Well, it's a story of failed leadership. I mean, Yiftach is not exactly Mr. Exemplar of how to get things done really well. The book of Shoftim of Judges is in general quite a strange book. Let's be clear. Danya talked about Delilah, who's a very interesting character as well. There are lots of interesting and, how shall I say, outside of the normal, perhaps, model female characters in Judges. There's also an equally, if not even more horrific story at the end of Judges with the nameless concubine of the Levite, who is actually repeatedly raped and tortured to death before dying on the doorstep, at which point the Levite cuts her up into pieces and sends them to the different tribes. I mean, that's a really horrific story. So Judges is a very strange book, and at the same time you have the story of Deborah in there and Yael, who are like these extremely powerful women. I think that there's a whole piece around the book of Judges and what are their stories. And in a sense, actually, the stories of the early settlement of the land are kind of like Wild West sort of stories, yeah? And I think you do get a lot of these sort of outliers, both in terms of the male and the female characters that you find in the text.
Just bring up another point. I don't know why that particular story is in Book of Shoftim, but do you know there's something very interesting in terms of how the rabbis in the Talmud read this story and use the story. In Masechet Nedarim, which it talks about the laws of vows and oaths, there's a constant theme that runs throughout where the rabbis do not like oaths and vows. They do not want people swearing, and not just because they're using rude words. They don't like it. And unfortunately, though, their way of we don't want people to make vows is don't teach about it. We're not going to teach people the laws of how to make vows because we don't really want people to go around making vows. So there's a huge kind of keeping the people ignorant. And I think they use the story of Yiftach and his daughter as a warning story because you see the mess that vows get into? Well, where actually another part of the story is you see what happens when you don't educate people. And I think a lot of the stories that run throughout is about who controls the knowledge and the systems of power and how you disseminate that power and how you disseminate kind of those sort of, so you kind of empower people to take control of their lives. And a lot of these women, they are the tools for the male society and they are kept in a place of ignorance so they are not able to then actually stand up and challenge the roles that they've been given.
Hi, thank you for that. That was really, really interesting. This is a question for any panelist, really. You touched on it a bit with Delilah, but I wanted to know what your thoughts were on the representation of non-Jewish women or within the Torah and how that sort of, I guess, is potentially maybe contrasted with Jewish women or women who are seen as valuable to the men of Israel, I guess, and how you think that sort of impacts on how we have an understanding of non-Jewish women and their relationship to us, or potentially with like Jewish men, I guess, and how those sort of attitudes trickle down. Does that make sense? Kind of.
Yeah. I mean, it's a double whammy, right? It's all of the psychic baggage about women and all of the psychic baggage about the other distilled onto one person. And so you have, some people like Delilah is a key example where there's just no way she's going to get out of this story alive as far as rabbinic interpretation goes. But you do have other non-Jewish women who actually do okay as far as the story goes. Joseph's wife, Asenath. The rabbis have give her mixed reviews, needless to say. But in the shot of the story, they managed to live a perfectly reasonably comfortable life. Everybody's happy, and he manages to save the Israelite people. And so you don't see the conflict as much. But in places where there are fault lines, where there are places of dissonance and conflict between Jews and non-Jews, so often it falls on women's heads.
There's a great Hellenic romance called Joseph and Asenath, by the way, which is a fantastic story. Anyway, that's an aside. I mean, there are whole sort of academic treatises on the status of foreign women in the Hebrew Bible, and there are lots of different types and categories. Probably the most famous is Ruth, who also, of course, refers back to the story of Tamar and Judah, with Tamar also being a foreign woman. Very often, foreign women are sexualized, so that kind of otherness piece, also Bathsheba, she's the wife of Uriah, who's not an Israelite either. There's a kind of sexualization of otherness. Rachav, oh yeah, absolutely. And the way that those women are made safe in some circumstances is by to have them be subsumed by the story. So, eventually Ruth actually disappears from her own book. At the end of the story of Ruth is the story of Naomi taking the child from her and breastfeeding that child, and it becomes Naomi's child. And Ruth completely disappears from the story, right? It's a story of assimilation to the point of lacking one's own identity. And where non-Israelite women retain their identities, it's often in stories where they are the Jezebel character, for lack of, where they become bad guys, bad women, as it were. So I think there's a huge tension in the text between these two sides.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with that. I mean, it's not all bad. It's mostly bad, but it's not all bad. I mean, we do have a couple of examples. For instance, Moshe's wife, where you think that she's not Jewish, and in many contexts she seems to know or highlight points of Judaism better than Moshe himself does, and causes huge arguments amongst Miriam and Aaron, because they're saying she's right, and how you're treating her is wrong, and sort of this is not okay. And he basically has to directly invoke God to sort of to hold up his argument. It's even in that kind of positive, this is a sort of righteous Gentile who kind of is familiar with seemingly sort of Judaism and what should be going on. There's still that kind of tension of, do we really just sort of, are they just being used as a foil to kind of counterpoint the, oh well, look, these people know Judaism better than you. If they know that better than you, then sort of, how bad are you? Which in itself is kind of not unproblematic. But it's they're not all lascivious, wanton heathens who come and take our men. There is room for subtlety, there is room for nuance, and there is room for people who are actually sort of their own characters and their own women within that.
Going from the subtle and the nuance, I'm going to the grotesque. And that is, I just want to sort of finish off this thought about the kind of what happens to non-Jewish women in terms of how they're portrayed in the Talmud. And I'm going to go to the very grotesque way it's done, which is Vashti and Esther in Masechet Megillah. And there you have this character in the text of the Tanakh, in the Megillah Esther, where she sort of disappears. She refuses to come and she gets put away, and Achashverosh needs a new wife. In the Talmud, though, she becomes an animal. And she grows a tail, she grows horns. There's even one interpretation, she grows a penis. She becomes not a woman. She either becomes this little bit male, or she becomes actually quite animalistic. And she becomes quite savage in how they portray her. Turn the page of the Talmud, though, you have a portrayal of Esther and how beautiful Esther was. And Esther was beautiful because everybody who saw her projected onto her, their idea of beauty. She becomes like a mirror or kind of a siphon for whatever beauty you want to project on. And so you have this very grotesque kind of opposites there within the Talmud about this Jewish beautiful princess and this really ugly, disgusting woman. And it kind of comes down into contemporary. A couple of years ago, Michael Epstein, who is a professor of art history, gave us a presentation at Limmud, which really stuck in my head, and that was about depictions of Megillat Esther, contemporary depictions of Megillat Esther, especially in the kind of more right-wing Orthodox communities, where depictions of women are very rare in terms of in illustrated Megillot. You have lots of men. You might have Esther in terms of a bit of light or maybe a hand, but you wouldn't really see her. You don't have images of women in their books, except when it comes to Vashti and also to Zeresh, and like, actually you can portray her because she's no longer a woman. She's no longer a human woman. She's become an animal. And I think that racism mixed with the misogyny makes for a very toxic breed of complete otherness and lack of dignity and respect given to these women.
I know technically she's not biblical, but I wondered if you had any comments to make about the character of Lilith in this context.
So, a number of years ago, I edited an anthology called Yentl's Revenge on the next wave of Jewish feminism. And I put out this call to the universe, dear internet, please send me essays. And this brilliant essay came in by a woman named Yiska Rosenfeld, who I believe is a Reconstructionist rabbi now. I sort of lost track of her. But she's got a lovely read, so I'll share it with you. She talks about Lilith as the archetypal second-wave feminist, in the way that she was reclaimed throughout feminism as this woman who said, this is really more about Eve than it is about Lilith, but it's a nice little... I won't... So the story of Lilith, for those who do not know, there's a midrash in... there are, if you look closely, two creation stories, right? First it says, and God created humans, man and woman, God created them. And then we finish chapter 1 of Genesis, we move into chapter 2, and suddenly we're breathing, life into Adam's nostrils and creating Eve and all of this. So there are all sorts of questions. What's with the two creation stories? And so one version of the story that appears in some medieval midrash is that Adam had a first wife, and her name was Lilith, and she refused to lie on the bottom during sex. She said, "Why should I be beneath you? Because we were created of the same earth." And then she gets cast out of the Garden of Eden for her rebellion, and medieval times she gets made into this demonic character that causes sudden infant death syndrome and all of these things. And so at a certain point, second wave feminists said, how great. This woman said, no thank you to the patriarchy, and she got booted out. And Yiska's read is that is one very important, powerful way to stand up to oppression. But that Eve's way, that she called the third wave feminist approach, is she chose to eat the apple. She chose to say, listen, I'm going to change. But then she also offered the apple to Adam. And she said, I am, nobody's talking to me, nobody's engaging with me. I am not going to stay with the status quo. I'm changing. If you'd like, you can come along for the ride and change with me. And we can create something new together. And in fact, finally, after Adam had named all the animals, and Adam and God are buddy-buddy, then finally Eve, gets her own name, right? She becomes Chava, or is supposed to, Adam's wife. And she then gets to name her children. And it says Kona is the word that's used for Konaim Elohim. She is used for how she's naming her children. As creating, like Konei Shemayim Va'aretz. So it's a parallel word for what God is doing with Eve. So that's one read of Lilith that I really like, is that it's one possible powerful way to stand up to oppression among several options. And I think which option you deploy depends on the situation and the context.
You're doing in reading these stories compares and contrasts with what historians do in other areas. Take the history of science and the paucity of female kind of role models in science for young women today who are becoming scientists. Take what happened with the Bank of England and trying to put a woman on a banknote. what is it about what you're doing, exploring this tradition? Is it the same? Is it different?
So for a couple of millennia, if not more, the people who commented on the biblical text were all men. That's it. They were all men. And they asked questions that men from a particular educated position of a degree of authority and power asked about the text. And actually, I'm of the view there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is that they were the only people empowered to ask questions of the texts and find answers. And so they said things like, oh dear, what if a dog had come out of his house? Instead of saying, oh dear, a living, breathing girl came out of his house and he was going to sacrifice her. Because as a woman, when I look at that text and I want to ask a question, I want to say, oh my God, if my daughter came out of the house, I wouldn't be worried about my, vow. I'd just go, sorry, I didn't say that, or whatever, right? So I think there's a piece about asking our own questions, having our own, and of course this goes, back a couple of decades now, as Elizabeth Schuster-Fiorenza, who is sort of the grandmother now of feminist biblical studies, coined this phrase, a hermeneutic of suspicion, to take the text and to be suspicious about it, to ask questions from a position of, hold on a minute, this is what I was taught, this is what I learned, but actually my lived experience as a woman is something else, and I want to ask other questions. That's one possibility. There's another hermeneutic, who I'm sure Danya can talk about herself since she coined the phrase, which is a hermeneutic of curiosity, to which I'm eternally grateful, we'll talk later, which says, I want to be curious about this text. I want to not necessarily deal with it from that spacious suspicion of unsurety, but actually I'm allowed to be curious about the text. I want to know more about it. I want to be engaged with it. As it happens in my own work, I'm not particularly interested in stories about women, because I think that for several decades now, what most feminist scholars have done is looked for stories about women, because that's where they see themselves reflected, and try to talk about stories about women. And what I'm interested in is being a Bible scholar in the same way that for 2,500 years men were Bible scholars. They didn't say, where are the stories only about men, and those would be the only ones I'll comment on. I'm actually really interested in what happens if I ask questions about any part of the text, and what are the different questions that I bring to it, and the different answers that I'm going to bring to it, because I have a different lived experience, a different approach, different ideas, and those would be because I'm female, but because I'm also living in the 21st century, because I'm practicing a non-Orthodox Jew, because I have a complex ethnic heritage, whatever it might be. And owning all of those things is really important. And my voice, along with all of these women and loads of other women, have to be added to the tradition for us to have a tradition that is representative of all of us.
So I just want to reiterate my discomfort, which is the nice way of putting it, about this role modelling, which goes on in terms of how biblical characters are taught to girls or put up for girls to study. And my kind of passion to actually look at the stories, and especially why I brought Talia, is to kind of, she's not a role model, she's fascinating. And that's because if the flip side is basically, if you're casting all these characters, these role models, and saying how good they are, it doesn't allow a complexity of characters to develop, and it just sort of whitewashes it all. And it whitewashes that kind of complex ambivalence that we ourselves have as we go through our life. And it also allows, by knowing about Italia, you can't really hear when people kind of make sweeping generalizations about female leadership, and kind of about how nurturing women are. You kind of go, Italia, murdering grandmother, nurturing? I don't think so. And she's in the Tanakh, and she's quite important in that narrative. And the fact that you haven't heard of her, or you don't know that story, means that you can say nonsense like that without blinking, without any kind of, oh, maybe I'm wrong. And it just allows for these very glossed over generalizations which are put up for young women and girls that they should be like, because that's supposedly what feminine is. And when you kind of don't really teach the full stories, you can make those generalizations. But as soon as you know a little bit more and you realize actually it's very complex and you can't do that, you don't trap women and young girls in those little boxes.
Thank you. I think actually that's the perfect last note to end on. Please join me in thanking our talk panelists. And like the best of Limmud sessions, I hope this has left you with many more questions than answers. Thank you very much.